Hi, I'm Natalie Brooks. 3 years ago, my in-laws hired the best private investigator in Portland to destroy my marriage by exposing my shameful past. What they didn't know was that Marcus Rivera wasn't just the city's most sought-after PI. He was my business partner, and we owned the detective agency together. The case they paid him $50,000 to investigate, it became the evidence that unraveled their own web of lies. The irony wasn't lost on me when Patricia Chen, my mother-in-law, personally handed Marcus a check to ruin the woman who helped him build his empire from nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown loft office as I stared at the manila folder Marcus had just placed on my mahogany desk. The brass nameplate reading, quote, Rivera and Brooks Investigations caught the amber glow from the vintage Edison bulbs we'd installed when we first moved into this converted warehouse space 2 years ago. Everything about this moment felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. Marcus Rivera stood across from me, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, the same stance he'd held during his 20 years with the Portland Police Department before we became partners. His dark eyes held a mixture of disbelief and what I could only describe as protective fury. At 52, Marcus had seen every kind of betrayal humans could inflict on each other, but this one had clearly rattled him. Natalie, he said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that made defendants confess and witnesses tell the truth. You need to sit down for this. I was already seated, but I understood what he meant. I gripped the armrests of my leather chair, the same chair I'd bought with my first commission check, after we'd successfully recovered $2 million in embezzled funds for a tech startup. That case had put Rivera and Brooks on the map. Now, apparently, we were investigating ourselves. Tell me everything, I whispered, though part of me wanted to sprint from the office and pretend this conversation had never happened. Marcus opened the folder with deliberate care, revealing a stack of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a detailed surveillance timeline. On top was a cashier's check made out to Rivera and Brooks Investigations in the amount of $50,000. The signature at the bottom made my stomach drop. Patricia Chen, my mother-in-law. She walked in here yesterday afternoon, Marcus began, settling into the client chair across from my desk. Wore that cream-colored Chanel suit, the one she saves for intimidating people. Had her hair pulled back so tight I thought she might have had work done. He paused, studying my face. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patricia Chen and said she needed our most discreet services. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest since the day I married David Chen 3 years ago. Patricia had never approved of me, but I'd attributed her coldness to normal mother-in-law territory. David always brushed off my concerns, saying his mother was protective and would warm up eventually. Eventually had never arrived. What exactly did she ask you to do? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting from professional to deeply personal. She wanted me to conduct a comprehensive background investigation on David's wife. Said she suspected this woman was hiding something significant from her past that could destroy their family's reputation. He shook his head slowly. She handed me a photograph of you, Natalie. Your wedding photo. The irony hit me like a physical blow. For the past 18 months, Marcus and I had built our reputation on exposing the truth for clients who'd been deceived by people they trusted. We'd uncovered cheating spouses, fraudulent business partners, and identity thieves. Our tagline, printed on every business card and prominently displayed on our website, read, "The truth always surfaces. We just help it find the light." Now, the truth Patricia Chen was so desperate to uncover was sitting right across from the investigator she'd hired, signing his paychecks and helping him build case files on Portland's most complex mysteries. She doesn't know about us, I said, more to myself than to Marcus. She has no idea I'm your partner. None whatsoever, Marcus confirmed. When she asked about our success rate, I showed her our case wall. He gestured toward the far corner of the office where we displayed framed newspaper clippings, thank you letters from grateful clients, and photographs from cases we'd solved. She seemed impressed by the Henderson embezzlement case, the one where you traced those offshore accounts through 3 different countries. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. The Henderson case. That was my forensic accounting background that cracked that one wide open. I stood up and walked to the window, watching pedestrians hurry past on the street below, their umbrellas creating a moving mosaic of colors against the gray Portland afternoon. What did she tell you about her suspicions? Marcus flipped through several pages in the folder. She claims you're hiding a criminal past, says you've been evasive about your previous marriages, your financial history, and something about a business failure that involved federal investigators. He looked up at me. She specifically mentioned bankruptcy fraud and possible tax evasion. The words hung in the air between us like accusations waiting for a defense. I turned from the window to face him, seeing in his eyes the same question I'd been dreading for 3 years. Was there truth to any of it? "Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "You know my story. You've known it since the day we met at that forensic accounting conference in Seattle." "I know what you've told me," he replied gently. "But Patricia Chen has clearly done some preliminary digging. She brought documentation suggesting there are gaps in your history that don't add up." He handed me a photocopied article from the Portland Business Journal dated 6 years ago. The headline read, "Local Accounting Firm Faces Federal Investigation." Below it was a grainy photograph of a woman with shoulder-length dark hair walking quickly past a row of microphones, her face partially obscured by a briefcase held at an awkward angle. The woman was me. I sat back down heavily, the weight of secrets I'd carried for years suddenly pressing against my chest like a physical force. "I was going to tell you about Cascade Financial," I said quietly. "Eventually." "Cascade Financial was your company?" "My ex-husband's company," I corrected. "Trevor Caldwell. We were married for 18 months, and during that time he used my forensic accounting credentials to legitimize what turned out to be an elaborate money laundering operation." I touched the faded scar on my left temple, a reminder of the night everything fell apart. When the FBI raided our offices, I discovered I'd been signing documents I didn't fully understand, authorizing transactions that funded everything from illegal gambling operations to drug trafficking. Marcus set down the folder and gave me his full attention. In our 2 years of partnership, I'd never seen him more focused. "Were you charged?" The federal prosecutor offered me immunity in exchange for my cooperation in building the case against Trevor and his associates. I pulled my hair back, revealing the scar more clearly. Trevor didn't appreciate my willingness to testify. This happened the night before I was scheduled to give my deposition. "He did that to you?" I nodded. "Threw a crystal paperweight at my head during an argument. Told me that if I testified, he'd make sure I never worked in accounting again. Never found another husband, never had a normal life." I touched the scar again, a nervous habit I'd developed. The injury delayed my testimony by 3 weeks. During that time, Trevor disappeared with what was left of the company's liquid assets, about $4 million. Was he ever caught? The FBI tracked him to the Cayman Islands, but by then he'd established residency and the money had been moved through so many shell corporations that recovery was nearly impossible. I walked to our case wall and pointed to a photograph of Marcus and me at the Portland Business Awards dinner, where we'd won Small Business of the Year. Starting over in a new city, under my maiden name, building a reputation from scratch. That's how I ended up at that forensic accounting conference where we met.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing information that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about his business partner. Finally, he spoke. "Patricia Chen believes she's hired me to expose a criminal. What she's actually done is hired me to investigate someone who helped the FBI put criminals in prison. The bankruptcy was legitimate," I added. "Trevor's financial crimes destroyed my credit, my savings, everything. I lost my house, my car, my entire professional network. The only thing that saved me was testifying against him, which gave me credibility with the federal agencies that later hired me as a consultant." "That's how you developed expertise in offshore banking and shell corporation structures." "Exactly. Every complex financial case we've solved for our clients, I learned those skills by helping the FBI unravel what my ex-husband had built." I returned to my chair, feeling emotionally drained but oddly relieved. I should have told you from the beginning, but I was terrified that my past would contaminate everything we were building together. Marcus reopened the folder and spread out several photographs across my desk. They were surveillance photos. Me entering and leaving our office building, meeting with clients at coffee shops, shopping for groceries, having dinner with David at our favorite Italian restaurant in the Pearl District. She had you followed for 2 weeks before she came to me, he said. Professional surveillance, not amateur work. Someone with real training and expensive equipment. I picked up one of the photos, a close-up shot of me laughing at something David had said during dinner. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 nights ago. This feels like a violation I can't even describe. There's more. Marcus handed me a thick packet of papers. Financial records going back 5 years. Bank statements, credit reports, tax returns. She somehow obtained documents that should require a court order. I flipped through the papers, recognizing my own financial history laid out in methodical detail. My student loan payments, my modest salary during the first year after moving to Portland, the gradual increase in income as I built my consulting practice, then the sharp jump, when Marcus and I formalized our partnership, and Rivera and Brooks started landing major clients. How did she get these? That's what concerns me most, Marcus said grimly. This level of financial surveillance suggests she has connections with people who operate outside legal boundaries. Private investigators can't just request bank records without proper authorization. The implications were staggering. Patricia Chen hadn't just hired someone to investigate me. She'd hired someone to illegally access my private financial information. The irony was almost laughable. She was attempting to expose me as a criminal by committing crimes herself. There's something else, Marcus continued, pulling out a final document from the folder. She wants me to prepare a comprehensive report that she can present to David as evidence that his marriage is based on deception. Her exact words were, "I want documentation that will force him to see who he really married." I stared at the contract Patricia had signed, her elegant signature authorizing Marcus to investigate every aspect of my life with the specific goal of destroying my marriage to her son. The retainer she'd paid would cover weeks of intensive investigation, surveillance, and document analysis. She's planning to ambush David with this information, I said, understanding the full scope of her plan. Probably at Sunday dinner, in front of the entire Chen family. That would be my assessment as well. She mentioned wanting to clear the air before David makes any long-term commitments. Marcus paused. She specifically asked about evidence that might indicate financial deception or hidden assets. The Chen family's Sunday dinners were legendary affairs held at Patricia and Robert's Lake Oswego estate. The entire extended family gathered every week. David's siblings, their spouses and children, various aunts and uncles, business associates. It was Patricia's stage, the place where family decisions were announced, relationships were blessed or condemned, and reputations were built or destroyed. She wants to humiliate me in front of everyone, I said, the full picture finally coming into focus. Present her evidence, force David to choose between his family and his wife, and ensure that if he chooses me, he does so knowing the entire family disapproves. The thing is, Natalie, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with expression I'd seen him wear when he was about to spring a trap on an unsuspecting target. Patricia Chen made one crucial mistake when she hired Rivera and Brooks Investigations. What's that? His smile was sharp and calculating. She assumed she was hiring someone who would work against your interests. What she actually did was give us unlimited access to investigate her. I felt something shift inside my chest, a movement from defensive fear to strategic thinking. You're saying we turn the investigation around. I'm saying we accept her retainer and conduct the most thorough investigation she's ever seen, Marcus replied. We'll investigate you, just like she requested. We'll document every detail of your past, your financial history, your connection to Cascade Financial, and your testimony that helped the FBI convict federal criminals. And in the process, we'll also investigate how Patricia Chen obtained illegal financial documents, who she hired to conduct unauthorized surveillance, and what other laws she might have broken in her quest to destroy your marriage. Marcus stood up and walked to our evidence wall, pointing to a photograph from one of our most successful cases. Remember the Morrison custody battle? The husband hired 3 different private investigators to find dirt on his ex-wife. What we discovered was that he was the one hiding assets and manipulating financial records. I remembered the Morrison case well. It had taken us 6 weeks to untangle the husband's web of deception. But when we presented our findings to the family court judge, the evidence was so comprehensive that custody was immediately awarded to our client, along with substantial financial sanctions against her ex-husband. You think Patricia is hiding something? I think Patricia Chen is desperate enough to break federal privacy laws to investigate her daughter-in-law, Marcus replied. People don't take risks like that unless they have something significant to protect. I walked to my computer and pulled up our standard client intake form, the same document we used for every case. If we're going to do this, we do it properly. Full documentation, regular progress reports, complete transparency about our methodology and findings. She'll expect weekly updates, Marcus agreed, which means we'll have weekly opportunities to ask questions about her sources, her motivations, and her expectations. And if she's obtained illegal financial documents, she'll have to explain how she got them if she wants us to incorporate that information into our official report. Marcus nodded approvingly. Patricia Chen thinks she's hired the best private investigators in Portland to destroy you. What she's actually done is handed us the resources and legal authority to investigate her entire operation. I felt the familiar thrill I always experienced at the beginning of a complex case, the moment when seemingly random pieces of information began forming a coherent pattern. How long do we have? She wants a preliminary report within 2 weeks, with a comprehensive final report due before David's birthday next month. Marcus checked his calendar. That gives us exactly 28 days to build our case. 28 days to investigate myself and document everything she's trying to hide in the process. The beautiful thing about this situation, Marcus said, closing the folder and returning it to my desk, is that we have something Patricia Chen doesn't expect us to have. What's that? Complete honesty about your past, legal authority to investigate her activities, and the element of surprise. He paused at the door to his office. She thinks she's controlling this investigation, but she just handed control to the person she's trying to destroy. As Marcus disappeared into his office to begin planning our strategy, I remained at my desk, staring out at the Portland skyline as the rain continued its steady rhythm against our windows. For 3 years, I'd lived with the constant fear that my past would eventually surface and destroy the life I'd built with David. I'd imagined a dozen different scenarios where the truth about Cascade Financial and my marriage to Trevor Caldwell would emerge at the worst possible moment. I'd never imagined that my mother-in-law would pay me $50,000 to investigate myself. The intercom on my desk buzzed, and Marcus's voice filled the office. Natalie, I'm pulling our standard surveillance equipment. If Patricia Chen wants a thorough investigation, she's going to get one. I picked up the phone. What's our first move? Tomorrow morning, I'm calling Mrs. Chen to schedule our first progress meeting. I'll need to interview her about her specific concerns and the preliminary information she's already gathered. And I'll be there? Marcus laughed, and I could hear the anticipation in his voice. Oh, you'll definitely be there. As my partner and our firm's lead forensic analyst, your expertise will be essential for evaluating the evidence she's provided. I hung up the phone and opened my laptop, creating a new case file in our database. Chen Investigation, subject, Natalie Brooks. For the first time in 3 years, I was looking forward to Sunday dinner with the Chen family. Patricia Chen wanted to expose my past. She was about to get her wish, along with a few surprises she hadn't bargained for. The following Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made Portland feel like a postcard. I sat in my car outside the Starbucks on Northwest 23rd, watching Patricia Chen through the floor-to-ceiling windows as she checked her Rolex for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. She'd chosen this location for our first progress meeting, claiming it was convenient to her book club, though I suspected she wanted the psychological advantage of familiar territory. Marcus emerged from the coffee shop carrying 3 drinks, his expression carefully neutral as he approached my vehicle. We'd spent the previous evening rehearsing this encounter, mapping out questions that would seem routine, while gathering intelligence about her illegal document acquisition. The key was making Patricia feel in control, while she unknowingly provided us with evidence of her own criminal activity. "She's nervous," Marcus said, sliding into the passenger seat and handing me a vanilla latte. "Keeps fidgeting with her wedding ring and scanning the room like she's expecting someone to recognize her." "Guilty conscience," I replied, adjusting the small recording device pinned to my jacket lapel. "People who operate within legal boundaries don't act paranoid during routine business meetings." Through the window, I watched Patricia smooth her platinum blonde hair and straighten her navy blue blazer. At 62, she maintained the kind of polished appearance that spoke of personal trainers, weekly salon appointments, and a wardrobe budget that exceeded most people's annual salaries. Her handbag alone probably cost more than Marcus and I had spent furnishing our entire office. "Remember," Marcus said, "I'm Marcus Rivera, private investigator. You're Natalie Brooks, forensic analyst and my business partner. We're here to discuss the investigation she commissioned regarding David Chen's wife." The absurdity of the situation hit me again. I was about to sit across from my mother-in-law while she paid me to destroy myself, completely unaware that the woman she was trying to eliminate was taking detailed notes on every word she spoke. We entered the coffee shop together, and Patricia immediately stood to greet us, her smile bright and artificial. "Mr. Rivera, thank you so much for meeting with me on such short notice." "My pleasure, Mrs. Chen," Marcus replied smoothly. "I'd like you to meet my business partner, Natalie Brooks. She's our lead forensic analyst and will be assisting with your case." Patricia extended her hand to me, and for a moment, I feared she might recognize something familiar in my face. We'd met dozens of times at family gatherings, shared countless conversations over holiday dinners, even shopped together for David's birthday gifts. But her expression remained politely blank, seeing only a professional colleague rather than the daughter-in-law she was paying to investigate. "Ms. Brooks," she said, her grip firm and brief. "I hope Mr. Rivera has briefed you on the sensitive nature of this investigation." "Completely," I replied, settling into my chair and opening a leather portfolio. "I understand you have concerns about your son's wife that require professional verification." Patricia's posture relaxed slightly. "Exactly. David is my youngest child, and perhaps because of that, he's always been somewhat naive about people's motivations. This woman he married came from nowhere, with no family connections, no professional references that anyone could verify." She paused to sip her cappuccino. Quote, "A mother's intuition tells me she's hiding something significant." Marcus leaned forward, pen poised over his notepad. "Can you be more specific about these concerns? What initially made you suspicious?" "Several things," Patricia replied, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "First, she claimed to be a forensic accountant, but when I tried to research her previous employment, I found huge gaps in her work history. She said she'd worked for various consulting firms, but none of them had any record of employing someone with her name." I kept my expression neutral while making notes, though internally I was fascinated by her research methodology. "The gaps in my employment history existed because I'd worked under my married name, Teresa Caldwell, during my disastrous 18 months with Trevor. After our divorce and my relocation to Portland, I'd legally returned to using my maiden name, creating an apparent discontinuity in my professional record." "What other concerns do you have?" I asked, genuinely curious about what else she'd discovered. Patricia reached into her handbag and withdrew a manila envelope. She claimed her parents died in a car accident when she was in college, but I couldn't find any obituaries, accident reports, or insurance claims that supported this story. She slid the envelope across the table. I also couldn't find any record of her attending the university she claimed to graduate from. Marcus accepted the envelope but didn't open it immediately. "How were you able to access insurance claims and university records?" "Those are typically protected by privacy laws." For the first time since we'd sat down, Patricia's confident facade flickered. "I have a friend who works in insurance investigation. She was able to make some informal inquiries." "Informal inquiries into private insurance records without proper authorization could constitute a federal crime," I said casually, making a note in my portfolio. "We'll need to document our sources carefully to ensure any evidence we gather will be legally admissible." Patricia's face flushed slightly. "Of course. I wouldn't want to compromise your investigation with improperly obtained information. Marcus opened the envelope and examined its contents while I watched Patricia's body language. Her fingers drummed against the table, and she kept glancing toward the coffee shop entrance as if expecting unwelcome visitors. Classic signs of someone who knew they were operating outside legal boundaries. Mrs. Chen, Marcus said, looking up from the documents, some of these appear to be official financial records, bank statements, credit reports, tax documents. How did you obtain these? The question hung in the air like smoke. Patricia's drumming fingers stopped, and she reached for her cappuccino with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. I hired another investigative firm to conduct preliminary research before coming to you. They provided those documents as part of their initial assessment. Which firm? I asked, my pen ready to record her answer. I'd prefer not to say, Patricia replied quickly. They requested confidentiality due to the sensitive nature of their research methods. Marcus and I exchanged a meaningful glance. Legitimate private investigation firms didn't request confidentiality about their identity, and they certainly didn't use sensitive research methods to obtain protected financial documents. Patricia had clearly hired someone who operated in legal gray areas, possibly crossing into outright criminal activity. That's unusual, Marcus said diplomatically. Most reputable firms are proud to have their work referenced by subsequent investigators. It helps establish the credibility of the evidence. Well, Patricia said, her voice becoming defensive, perhaps their methods were more thorough than usual. The point is, the information they provided raises serious questions about this woman's financial history and personal background. I flipped through the documents while Patricia watched anxiously. Seeing my own financial records spread across the table felt surreal, like reading someone else's diary. Bank statements from my first year in Portland showed the modest deposits from my consulting work, the careful budgeting of someone rebuilding their life from scratch. Credit reports documented the slow process of reestablishing my financial reputation after the bankruptcy caused by Trevor's crimes. These records show someone who experienced significant financial difficulties several years ago, I said, looking up at Patricia. Bankruptcy, damaged credit, a period of very low income followed by gradual recovery. What specifically concerns you about this pattern? Patricia leaned forward eagerly. Don't you see? She's clearly been involved in some kind of financial crime or fraud. People don't just lose everything and then rebuild unless they're hiding assets or involved in illegal activities. The irony was breathtaking. Patricia Chen was accusing me of financial crimes while sitting across from evidence that she'd committed federal privacy violations to obtain my protected financial information. She was so focused on constructing a narrative of my supposed criminality that she'd become a criminal herself. Actually, Marcus said thoughtfully, this financial pattern is more consistent with someone who was the victim of financial crime rather than the perpetrator. The bankruptcy appears legitimate, filed through proper legal channels. The subsequent rebuilding shows steady, documented income from verifiable sources. Patricia's expression tightened. But what about the employment gaps? The missing family records? The inconsistencies in her educational background? Those are certainly worth investigating. I agreed. However, there are legitimate explanations for apparent gaps in someone's documented history. Name changes due to marriage or divorce, family estrangement, educational records maintained under different naming conventions. I closed the portfolio and looked directly at Patricia. Before we proceed with a full investigation, I need to ask about the legal implications of the preliminary research you've already conducted. What do you mean? Marcus cleared his throat. Ms. Brooks raises an important point. If the previous investigative firm obtained these financial documents through illegal means, any evidence derived from that information could be inadmissible in legal proceedings and could expose you to significant criminal liability. Patricia's face went pale. Criminal liability? Absolutely, I said, maintaining a professional tone while watching her panic. Federal privacy laws carry severe penalties for unauthorized access to financial records, credit reports, and personal information. If your son were to discover that you'd obtained his wife's private financial information illegally, he could file criminal charges against both you and whoever helped you acquire these documents. But I was trying to protect him, Patricia protested, her voice rising enough to attract attention from nearby tables. Your motivations are understandable, Marcus said soothingly, but the law doesn't recognize good intentions as a defense for privacy violations. That's why Rivera and Brooks Investigations operates strictly within legal boundaries. We can conduct a thorough investigation using only lawful methods. Patricia struggled to compose herself, clearly realizing for the first time that her zealous investigation might have legal consequences she hadn't considered. What would you need to conduct a proper investigation? Standard authorization forms signed by you as the client, I replied. Written consent for us to conduct interviews with relevant parties. A clear scope of work that defines what we're investigating and what methods we'll use. I paused, studying her face. And complete disclosure of any information you've already obtained through other sources, so we can determine what evidence is legally usable and what might compromise the investigation. The thing is, Mrs. Chen, Marcus added, if you've already obtained evidence through questionable means, the most ethical approach might be to discard that information entirely and start fresh with a completely clean investigation. Patricia clutched her handbag like a lifeline. How long would that take? A thorough background investigation conducted through proper legal channels typically requires 4 to 6 weeks. I said, however, given the complexity of the concerns you've raised, we might be able to provide preliminary findings within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Patricia repeated, her relief obvious. That would be perfect. David's birthday is next month, and I'd like to have clear information before we make any family announcements. Marcus and I had discussed this timeline extensively. 2 weeks would give us enough time to document Patricia's illegal activities, while preparing a comprehensive report that would expose her crimes rather than mine. The birthday deadline suggested she was planning to present her quote, evidence at David's celebration, probably in front of the entire extended family. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Marcus said, pulling out a standard contract. Our fee structure for comprehensive background investigations. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. Cost isn't a concern. I want the most thorough investigation possible. Our standard rate for this type of case is $500 per day, plus expenses, I said. For a comprehensive investigation over 2 weeks, including surveillance, document analysis, and interview coordination, we estimate the total cost at approximately $12,000. Patricia didn't even blink. Fine, I'll provide an additional retainer today. As she wrote out another check, I marveled at her casual attitude toward spending thousands of dollars to investigate someone she'd never bothered to understand. She'd probably spent more money trying to destroy me than she'd ever spent trying to get to know me. Mrs. Chen, Marcus said as she handed him the check, I need to ask one final question. If our investigation reveals information that contradicts your suspicions, would you be prepared to accept those findings? Patricia's smile was cold and certain. Mr. Rivera, I've been married for 35 years and raised 4 successful children. I know when someone is hiding something significant. Your investigation will confirm what I already know. We wrapped up the meeting with Patricia, promising to provide additional background information, and Marcus scheduling our next progress update for the following week. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, she turned to me with what appeared to be genuine concern. Ms. Brooks, I hope you understand that this isn't about personal animosity. I simply want what's best for my son. Of course, I replied, shaking her hand again. Every mother wants to protect her children. After Patricia left, Marcus and I remained at the table pretending to review our notes while actually processing what had just occurred. I'd spent an hour listening to my mother-in-law describe me as a criminal, while she unknowingly confessed to committing federal crimes in her quest to expose my supposed illegal activities. She's hired at least 2 investigative firms, Marcus said quietly, one of which was willing to obtain protected financial documents through illegal means. She's admitted to having a contact in the insurance industry who conducted unauthorized searches of private records. And she's prepared to spend thousands of additional dollars to continue investigating her own daughter-in-law. The question is why, I replied. This level of paranoia and financial commitment suggests there's something more at stake than typical mother-in-law disapproval. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. People don't usually break federal laws unless they're protecting something significant. Patricia Chen isn't just trying to expose your past, she's trying to prevent something specific from happening. Like what? That's what we're going to find out during our investigation of Mrs. Patricia Chen. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the financial documents Patricia had provided, seeing my own life reduced to columns of numbers and transaction records. The house David and I shared in the Hawthorne district was quiet, except for the sound of rain against the windows and the occasional car passing on our tree-lined street. David was in Seattle for 3 days, meeting with potential investors for his sustainable restaurant concept. He'd been working on this project for over a year, developing menus focused on locally sourced ingredients and zero-waste preparation methods. His passion for the venture was infectious, and I'd been helping him with the financial projections and business plan development during my evening hours. What Patricia didn't know, what none of the Chen family knew, was that David's restaurant concept had attracted serious interest from a group of environmentally focused investors. If his meetings went well, he'd be offered funding to open not just one restaurant, but a chain of sustainable dining establishments throughout the Pacific Northwest. The investment would make David financially independent from his family's restaurant empire for the first time in his life. I suspected Patricia's urgency to investigate me was connected to this potential business opportunity. If David secured independent funding and launched his own restaurant venture, he'd no longer be dependent on the Chen family business or subject to his mother's influence over his career decisions. An independent David might be more willing to stand up to his family's disapproval of his wife. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Meetings going better than expected. Investors love the concept. Miss you. I responded with encouragement and love, but didn't mention that his mother was currently paying me to investigate myself. That conversation would have to wait until I had complete documentation of Patricia's illegal activities and a strategy for protecting both David and myself from the fallout. Marcus had sent me copies of all the documents Patricia provided, and I spent the next 2 hours creating a detailed analysis of how each piece of information had been obtained. The bank statements could only have been acquired through illegal access to protected financial databases. The credit reports required unauthorized use of someone's legitimate credentials for accessing consumer credit information. The insurance claims research violated federal privacy laws governing healthcare and accident records. Every document in Patricia's possession represented a separate federal crime. By midnight, I had compiled a comprehensive file documenting not just the privacy violations Patricia had committed, but the network of individuals she'd hired to help her break federal laws. The investigative firm she'd refused to name was almost certainly a company that specialized in providing illegal information to wealthy clients willing to pay premium prices for protected data. The beautiful irony was that while Patricia was convinced I was a criminal hiding my past, she'd committed more federal crimes in 2 weeks than I'd committed in my entire life. Her investigation of me had created a paper trail that would destroy her reputation and potentially result in criminal charges if it ever became public. I was preparing for bed when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's number. "Sorry to call so late," he said, "but I just finished running background checks on Patricia Chen, and you need to hear what I found." "What kind of background checks?" "The legal kind," Marcus replied with dark humor. "Public records, business filings, court documents, newspaper archives. All completely above board and admissible in any legal proceeding." I sat down at my kitchen table, sensing that whatever Marcus had discovered would change everything. "Tell me." "Patricia Chen has been married 4 times, not once. David's father, Robert, is husband number 4. The previous 3 marriages all ended in divorce, and in each case, Patricia received substantial financial settlements that were later challenged in court by her ex-husband's attorneys. The information hit me like a physical shock. She's been married 4 times? David thinks Robert is her only husband. It gets worse, Marcus continued. 2 of her previous husbands filed police reports claiming Patricia had hired private investigators to conduct illegal surveillance of their new wives and girlfriends after their divorces. One of those cases resulted in federal charges against the investigative firm she hired. I felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. She has a pattern of using private investigators to harass people she perceives as threats. That's exactly right. And here's the most interesting part. In 1987, Patricia Chen was arrested for attempting to bribe a court clerk to provide sealed divorce records belonging to her second husband's new fiancé. The charges were eventually dropped, but the arrest record is public information. David doesn't know about any of this. I doubt anyone in the current Chen family knows about this, Marcus said. Patricia has spent decades constructing a respectable identity as the devoted wife of a successful restaurateur. Her previous marriages, her legal troubles, her history of harassment, she's buried all of it behind a facade of respectability. I stared out my kitchen window at the quiet residential street where David and I had built our peaceful life together. Patricia Chen wasn't just investigating me to protect her son. She was investigating me to protect her own secrets from being exposed. If David became financially independent and emotionally distant from his family, he might start asking questions about his mother's past that she couldn't afford to answer. Marcus, I said slowly, I think Patricia is trying to destroy my marriage because she's afraid I might investigate her. What makes you say that? Think about it. She knows I'm a forensic accountant with expertise in financial crimes. She knows I've worked with federal investigators. If David and I ever had marital problems or family conflicts, I'd have both the skills and the motivation to dig into the Chen family's financial history. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. You're saying she's not trying to protect David from you. She's trying to protect herself from you. Exactly. And by hiring Rivera and Brooks Investigations to conduct an illegal investigation of me, she's given us legal authority and financial resources to expose everything she's been trying to hide. This changes our entire strategy, Marcus said. We're not just documenting her privacy violations, we're uncovering a decades-long pattern of criminal behavior and deception. How much of this can we document within 2 weeks? All of it, Marcus replied with the confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years building criminal cases. Public records, court filings, arrest reports, divorce proceedings. It's all there waiting to be compiled into a comprehensive report. I felt a familiar excitement building in my chest, the same feeling I got when a complex financial investigation suddenly revealed its underlying structure. Patricia Chen thinks she's hired us to expose my criminal past. What she's actually done is hire us to expose her criminal present. And the best part, Marcus added, is that she's paying us $12,000 to do it. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen, thinking about the woman who'd spent 3 years treating me like an unwelcome intruder in her family's life. Patricia Chen had dismissed me as unsuitable for her son, questioned my background, criticized my manners, and made it clear at every family gathering that I didn't belong in their social circle. What she'd never realized was that her own past was far more scandalous than anything she could discover about mine. While she was paying investigators to dig through my financial records and personal history, her own secrets were sitting in public court files, waiting for someone with the right skills to piece them together. Patricia Chen wanted to expose the truth about her daughter-in-law's past. In 2 weeks, she was going to get exactly what she'd paid for, along with a few revelations about her own history that she definitely hadn't bargained for. I smiled as I turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs to bed. Sometimes justice came in the form of irony, and sometimes it came with a price tag of exactly $50,000. The Portland Public Library's archival research room buzzed with the quiet intensity of scholars and genealogy enthusiasts, hunched over microfilm readers and dusty bound volumes. Marcus and I had claimed a corner table surrounded by stacks of court records, newspaper archives, and business filings dating back 30 years. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in a harsh, institutional glow that somehow made our discoveries feel more ominous. "Look at this," Marcus whispered, sliding a photocopied newspaper clipping across the table. The headline from the Portland Tribune, dated March 15, 1994, read, "Local woman charged in insurance fraud scheme." I adjusted my reading glasses and examined the article. The photograph showed a younger Patricia Chen, though she was using the name Patricia Donnelly at the time, being escorted from a downtown office building by 2 federal agents. According to the article, she'd been charged with filing fraudulent insurance claims totaling over $200,000, following a suspicious house fire that destroyed her previous husband's antique furniture business. Third husband, Marcus noted, consulting the timeline we'd constructed. Marriage lasted 14 months. Divorce was finalized 6 weeks after this arrest. The charges were dropped, I observed, reading the follow-up article dated 8 months later. Insufficient evidence to proceed with prosecution. Right, but look at the details of why the charges were dropped. Marcus pointed to a paragraph buried in the middle of the later article. Key witness relocated out of state and became unavailable for testimony. Primary evidence was ruled inadmissible due to search warrant irregularities. The insurance investigator who discovered the fraud was transferred to a different case before the trial. I felt a chill run down my spine. You think she interfered with the investigation? I think Patricia Chen has spent decades learning how to make legal problems disappear, Marcus replied grimly. And I think she's very good at it. We'd been conducting research for 6 days, methodically working backward through Patricia's documented history. What we'd uncovered was a pattern of behavior so consistent and calculated that it read like a criminal playbook. Each marriage had followed the same general structure. Patricia would meet a successful, recently divorced businessman, sweep him off his feet with charm and apparent vulnerability, marry him quickly, then begin systematically documenting his assets and personal relationships. The marriages typically lasted between 1 and 3 years, ending when Patricia would discover some convenient justification for divorce, usually infidelity or financial impropriety that she'd carefully documented. The divorce settlements were always substantial, and the ex-husbands invariably found themselves subject to ongoing harassment and surveillance, long after the legal proceedings concluded. Here's what bothers me most, I said, pulling out the folder containing Patricia's current financial records. She's been married to Robert Chen for 12 years. That's significantly longer than any of her previous marriages. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Which suggests either Robert is different from her previous husbands, or the circumstances of this marriage serve a different purpose. Or both, I added, examining the business incorporation documents we'd requested from the Oregon Secretary of State's office. Look at this. The Chen restaurant empire isn't actually owned by Robert Chen. The corporate structure shows Patricia as the majority shareholder in Chen Family Holdings, which owns all the individual restaurant properties. Marcus leaned over to study the documents. When did she acquire majority control? According to these filings, the ownership transferred to her gradually over the first 8 years of their marriage. Small percentage increases every year, presented as anniversary gifts and tax planning strategies. I traced the progression with my finger. By 2019, she owned 67% of the entire business. Robert Chen built a restaurant empire, and Patricia Chen legally maneuvered herself into controlling it. It's brilliant, actually, I said, though the admiration was purely professional. Instead of divorcing Robert and fighting for half his assets, she convinced him to gradually sign over control of the business while they were happily married. He probably thought he was being romantic and demonstrating trust in their partnership. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through the notes he'd taken during his conversation with a retired Portland police detective who'd worked financial crimes in the 1990s. Detective Morrison remembers Patricia well. Says she always had excellent legal representation, always seemed to know exactly what evidence prosecutors would need and how to make sure they couldn't get it. You think she was getting inside information about the investigations? Morrison thinks she was sleeping with someone in the district attorney's office, Marcus replied bluntly. He could never prove it, but there were too many coincidences. Search warrants getting delayed until evidence could be moved or destroyed. Key witnesses suddenly becoming uncooperative. Critical documents disappearing from evidence lockers. I stared at the newspaper photograph of Patricia being arrested in 1994, trying to reconcile the confident woman in handcuffs with the elegant mother-in-law, who served wine and cheese at family gatherings. How was she getting away with this? Someone with this kind of criminal history shouldn't be able to keep operating the same schemes for decades. Because she's not technically committing the same crimes, Marcus explained. Each marriage, each scheme, each harassment campaign is legally separate. prosecutors would have to prove a pattern of behavior across multiple jurisdictions and decades. That's incredibly difficult, especially when she's careful to use different methods and different co-conspirators for each operation. But we can prove the pattern because we're investigating her comprehensively rather than looking at individual incidents. Exactly. And we have something those individual prosecutors never had: access to her current criminal activity while it's happening. Quote, Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up the surveillance footage we'd collected over the past week. Using Patricia's retainer money, we'd hired a legitimate surveillance team to monitor her activities, ostensibly to gather intelligence about her concerns regarding me. What we'd actually documented was Patricia's ongoing criminal enterprise. The first video showed Patricia meeting with a thin, nervous-looking man in the parking lot of a Beaverton strip mall. She handed him an envelope, and he handed her a manila folder. Audio was poor, but we could clearly hear her saying, "I need everything from the last 5 years, and I need it by Friday." "That's Tony Marchetti," Marcus said, freezing the frame on the man's face. "Licensed private investigator. But he's been cited multiple times by the state regulatory board for operating outside legal boundaries. He specializes in providing clients with information they can't legally obtain through normal channels." The second video was more disturbing. Patricia was shown entering the offices of Northwest Credit Services, a debt collection agency that also offered skip tracing services to locate individuals who didn't want to be found. She spent 47 minutes inside, emerging with another manila envelope and what appeared to be a stack of computer printouts. Northwest Credit Services lost their license to access protected financial databases in 2018, Marcus explained. They were caught selling consumer credit information to unauthorized third parties. Technically, they're not supposed to have access to the systems they're clearly still using. How are they still operating? Shell companies, off-the-books payments, clients who don't ask questions about methodology. Marcus closed the laptop. Patricia Chen has built a network of people willing to break federal privacy laws in exchange for premium payments. I pulled out the folder containing the financial documents Patricia had provided during our coffee shop meeting. Every piece of information in here represents a separate federal crime. Bank statements that can only be obtained through illegal database access. Credit reports that require stolen credentials. Insurance claims that are protected under healthcare privacy laws. And she handed it all to us, documented on our official case file, with her signature on a retainer check acknowledging that she commissioned this illegal research. The magnitude of Patricia's mistake was staggering. In her desperation to expose my supposed crimes, she'd created a comprehensive paper trail documenting her own criminal conspiracy. Every payment to Tony Marchetti, every visit to Northwest Credit Services, every illegally obtained document she'd provided to us, was now part of an official investigation file that could be subpoenaed by federal prosecutors. "There's something else," Marcus said, pulling out a thick folder I hadn't seen before. "I spent yesterday afternoon at the federal courthouse, reviewing civil case filings. Patricia Chen has been sued 17 times in the last 15 years. I opened the folder and began reading through the case summaries. Sexual harassment lawsuit filed by a former employee of Chen Family Holdings. Defamation suit filed by a woman who dated Robert Chen before their marriage. Stalking charges filed by her second husband's current wife. Restraint order requested by a journalist who'd investigated the Chen family's business practices. 17 lawsuits," I repeated, trying to process the scope of her legal troubles. "All settled out of court," Marcus added. "All with confidentiality agreements preventing the plaintiffs from discussing the details publicly. Patricia Chen has spent over $500,000 in the last decade just making legal problems disappear." I found myself thinking about David, wondering how much of his mother's history he actually knew. He'd mentioned that Patricia could be intense about protecting the family, and he'd warned me that she sometimes hired private investigators to research his girlfriends before he got serious about them. But he'd presented this as harmless overprotectiveness, not criminal harassment. "Marcus, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "Do you think David knows about any of this?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. I think David knows his mother is controlling and paranoid. I think he knows she's hired private investigators before, but I don't think he knows about the multiple marriages, the criminal charges, or the extent of her harassment activities. What makes you so certain? Because if David knew the truth about his mother's history, he would have warned you before you married him. He wouldn't have let you walk into this situation blind. Marcus leaned back in his chair. David Chen thinks he's protecting you from his mother's disapproval. He has no idea he's married to the target of a criminal conspiracy. That evening, I sat in my car outside the Chen family's Lake Oswego estate, watching the warm lights spill from the windows of their sprawling Tudor-style home. David was still in Seattle, but I could see Robert's Mercedes in the driveway, along with two other vehicles I didn't recognize. Patricia was hosting one of her regular dinner parties, probably discussing restaurant business with investors or suppliers. From the outside, it looked like the perfect picture of successful family life. Manicured gardens, expensive cars, the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and good breeding. No one driving past would suspect that the elegant hostess inside was a career criminal with decades of fraud, harassment, and conspiracy charges in her past. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Contracts signed. Independent funding secured for 3 restaurants. Can't wait to tell you everything. Home tomorrow night. I smiled despite everything, genuinely happy that David's sustainable restaurant concept had attracted serious investment. His success meant he'd be financially independent from his family's business empire, free to make decisions based on his own values rather than his mother's expectations. It also meant Patricia would be even more desperate to eliminate me before David discovered the truth about her criminal activities. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed Marcus's number. I just got off the phone with Detective Morrison again, Marcus said without preamble. He's been thinking about our conversation, and he wants to meet with us tomorrow morning. What did you tell him? I told him we're conducting a private investigation that's uncovered evidence of ongoing criminal activity, and we need advice about how to proceed without compromising our client's interests. Can we trust him? Morrison retired with full honors after 30 years on the force. He spent the last 15 years of his career investigating white-collar crime and organized fraud schemes. If anyone can help us navigate the legal complexities of this situation, it's him. I glanced back at the Chen house, where I could see silhouettes moving behind the dining room curtains. Patricia's second progress meeting is scheduled for Friday afternoon. She's going to expect preliminary findings about her investigation of me. And she's going to get them, Marcus replied. We'll provide a comprehensive report documenting everything we've discovered about Natalie Brooks, forensic accountant and co-owner of Rivera Brooks Investigations, along with everything we've discovered about Patricia Chen, career criminal and fraud expert. The question is whether we present our findings to Patricia privately first, or whether we go directly to federal authorities with evidence of her criminal conspiracy. I watched a figure pass by one of the upstairs windows, probably Patricia checking on something in one of the bedrooms. What does Detective Morrison recommend? That's what we're going to find out tomorrow morning. But Natalie, there's something else you need to consider. What's that? Once we expose Patricia's criminal activities, there's no going back. This won't be a quiet family disagreement that gets resolved over Sunday dinner. We're talking about federal charges, criminal prosecution, asset forfeiture. The Chen family empire could collapse, and David's relationship with his mother will be destroyed forever. I sat in the darkness outside Patricia's house, thinking about the man I'd married and the life we'd built together. David was kind, honest, and genuinely caring. He worked hard, treated people with respect, and had spent the last year developing a business concept that would benefit both local farmers and environmentally conscious consumers. He didn't deserve to discover that his mother was a career criminal who'd spent decades manipulating and defrauding the people around her. But he also didn't deserve to remain ignorant while Patricia continued targeting me with illegal surveillance and harassment. Marcus, I said finally, David comes home tomorrow night. I need to tell him what we've discovered before Patricia has another chance to escalate her campaign against me. Are you prepared for how he might react? I thought about the question seriously. David might be angry that I'd investigated his mother without telling him. He might refuse to believe the evidence we'd compiled. He might choose to side with his family, rather than face the truth about Patricia's criminal history. But I'd learned something important during my previous marriage to Trevor Caldwell. Secrets and deception destroyed relationships more effectively than any external enemy could. If David and I were going to survive Patricia's assault on our marriage, we needed to face it together, armed with complete honesty and documented facts. I'm prepared for whatever his reaction might be, I replied. But I'm not prepared to let Patricia Chen destroy our marriage while he remains ignorant about who she really is. After ending the call with Marcus, I drove slowly through the quiet streets of Lake Oswego, past the manicured lawns and elegant homes of Portland's most exclusive neighborhood. This was Patricia's world, a place where money and influence could make problems disappear, where criminal behavior was hidden behind charitable donations and social respectability. But it was also a world built on carefully constructed lies, and Patricia had made the mistake of hiring the two people in Portland best equipped to expose those lies. She'd thought she was paying us to investigate her daughter-in-law's suspicious past. Instead, she'd financed the most comprehensive investigation of her own criminal history that anyone had ever conducted. In less than 48 hours, Patricia Chen would discover that the truth she'd been so eager to uncover wasn't the truth she'd expected to find. The next morning, Detective Morrison met us at a small diner in southeast Portland, far from the downtown business district, where he might encounter people who knew about our investigation. At 68, Morrison moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades navigating dangerous situations, and his pale blue eyes held the skeptical intelligence that had made him successful at uncovering complex financial crimes. I've been thinking about Patricia Chen for 25 years, Morrison said without preamble, settling into the booth across from Marcus and me. She's the one that got away, the criminal who was always just smart enough or just lucky enough to avoid serious consequences. You think she's been operating criminal schemes for 25 years? I asked. Morrison stirred sugar into his coffee with deliberate movements. I think Patricia Chen has been operating criminal schemes for longer than that. The cases I worked were just the time she got caught. He pulled out a worn notebook and flipped through pages covered with handwritten notes and faded newspaper clippings. 1987, attempted bribery of court personnel. 1992, insurance fraud charges. 1994, more insurance fraud. 1998, harassment and stalking charges. 2003, securities fraud investigation that went nowhere. 2007, tax evasion charges that were dropped due to procedural errors. All dropped or dismissed, Marcus observed. Every single one, Morrison confirmed. And always for reasons that suggested someone with inside knowledge of how investigations work. Evidence that disappeared at crucial moments. Witnesses who suddenly became unavailable. Procedural errors that invalidated months of investigative work. I leaned forward, studying Morrison's notebook. You think she was getting information about the investigations from someone inside law enforcement? I know she was, Morrison replied bluntly. In 1994, I was working the insurance fraud case when my captain suddenly reassigned me to a different investigation. 2 weeks later, all the physical evidence from Patricia's case was destroyed in what was ruled an accidental fire in the evidence storage facility. Convenient, Marcus said dryly. Too convenient. I started asking questions about who had access to information about evidence storage and case timelines. What I found was that Patricia Chen was romantically involved with Assistant District Attorney Michael Brennan, who had access to interdepartmental communications about ongoing investigations. Morrison pulled out a photograph from his notebook, showing Patricia at what appeared to be a formal dinner party. Standing next to her with his arm around her waist was a tall man with graying hair and an expensive suit. Michael Brennan, Morrison explained. Patricia met him during her second divorce proceedings in 1993. They had an affair that lasted almost 3 years, during which time several high-profile criminal cases against wealthy defendants fell apart due to procedural errors and evidence problems. Was Brennan ever investigated? Internal Affairs looked into it briefly, but Brennan had friends in high places, and Patricia was careful never to be directly connected to the cases that benefited from his inside information. Morrison closed the notebook. Brennan retired early with full benefits and moved to Arizona. Patricia married Robert Chen 6 months later. I felt pieces of Patricia's criminal methodology clicking into place. She wasn't just bribing officials or interfering with evidence. She was cultivating romantic relationships with people who had access to information she needed. Patricia Chen's greatest skill is identifying people with power and convincing them to use that power to benefit her. Morrison agreed. She's been doing it for decades, and she's gotten very good at it. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Morrison some of the surveillance footage we'd collected. She's still doing it. We have video of her meeting with Tony Marchetti, who provides illegally obtained financial information. We have documentation of her visits to Northwest Credit Services, which has been operating without proper licensing for years. Morrison examined the phone screen carefully. Tony Marchetti. I remember him. Used to be married to a clerk in the federal court system who had access to sealed records. The marriage lasted just long enough for Tony to build a client base of people who needed information they couldn't legally obtain. Let me guess, I said. Patricia introduced them. Patricia was a witness at their wedding, quote. Morrison confirmed. And when the marriage fell apart 2 years later, Tony kept the connections he'd made through his ex-wife's position. The scope of Patricia's criminal network was becoming clear. For decades, she'd been cultivating relationships with people who had access to protected information, legal insider knowledge, or the ability to make official problems disappear. She'd built a web of corruption that allowed her to operate outside legal boundaries while maintaining the appearance of respectability. Detective Morrison, I said, we need advice about how to proceed. Patricia Chen is our client, which means we have certain legal obligations to protect her interests. But she's also commissioned us to conduct illegal surveillance and document analysis. Morrison smiled grimly. She's put you in an interesting position. You're legally obligated to serve her interests, but her interests involve criminal activity. Can we report her crimes to federal authorities without violating client confidentiality? Absolutely, Morrison replied without hesitation. Client privilege doesn't protect criminal activity. If Patricia Chen hired you to commit crimes, or to cover up crimes she'd already committed, you're not only allowed to report that to authorities, you're legally required to do so. Marcus and I exchanged a meaningful look. Morrison had just given us the legal framework we needed to expose Patricia's criminal conspiracy, while protecting ourselves from charges of violating client confidentiality. There's something else. Morrison continued. Patricia Chen has been getting away with criminal activity for decades because she's always operated in isolation, one scheme at a time, with careful legal representation and plenty of money to make problems disappear. But you've documented a comprehensive pattern of ongoing criminal behavior. That changes everything. How so? RICO statutes, racketeering charges. Once you can prove an ongoing criminal enterprise involving multiple conspirators and decades of illegal activity, the penalties become much more severe, and the legal protections become much weaker. I felt a chill of anticipation mixed with apprehension. RICO charges were typically reserved for organized crime operations, drug cartels, and major corruption schemes. But Patricia Chen's decades-long pattern of fraud, harassment, and criminal conspiracy might well qualify for racketeering prosecution. Detective Morrison, Marcus said, if we provide this evidence to federal authorities, what happens to Patricia Chen? Morrison's smile was cold and satisfied. If the evidence is as comprehensive as you've described, Patricia Chen is finally going to face consequences she can't buy, charm, or manipulate her way out of. As we left the diner, I thought about David flying home from Seattle, excited about his successful meetings, and eager to share news of his independent restaurant funding. Tomorrow night, I'd have to tell him that his mother was facing federal racketeering charges, and that our marriage had been the target of a criminal conspiracy. But I'd also be able to tell him that Patricia Chen's 25-year criminal career was finally coming to an end. David's key turned in the front door lock at exactly 7:30 Thursday evening, and I heard him drop his travel bag in the entryway with the satisfied thud of someone who'd accomplished something significant. His voice carried through the house as he called out my name, filled with the kind of excitement that made me remember why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. I was standing in our kitchen, surrounded by printed documents, surveillance photographs, and legal case files that covered every available surface. 3 days of intensive research, had transformed our normally peaceful home into something that looked like a detective's evidence room. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to destroy David's homecoming celebration with revelations about his mother's criminal activities. "Natalie!" David appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face bright with success and anticipation. "The meetings went even better than I hoped. They're funding not just 3 restaurants, but potentially 8 locations throughout Oregon and Washington. We could be looking at..." His voice trailed off as he took in the scene around me. David Chen was 34 years old, with the kind of gentle intelligence that made people trust him immediately. He'd inherited his father's practical business sense and his mother's talent for reading people, though he used those abilities to build genuine relationships rather than manipulate them. Standing in our kitchen doorway, still wearing his travel clothes and carrying the excitement of his successful business venture, he looked younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. "What's all this?" he asked, moving closer to examine the documents spread across our dining table. I'd rehearsed this conversation dozens of times during the 3 days he'd been gone, but suddenly every carefully planned explanation felt inadequate. How do you tell someone you love that their mother is a career criminal who's been targeting you with illegal surveillance? How do you explain that the woman who raised them has spent decades defrauding, manipulating, and harassing innocent people? "David, I need you to sit down," I said, gesturing toward the chair I'd positioned so he could see the timeline Marcus and I had constructed on our kitchen wall. "What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you think you know about your family." He remained standing, his expression shifting from excitement to confusion, to the first hints of defensive concern. "This is about my mother, isn't it? Natalie, I know she can be difficult sometimes, but whatever disagreement you two have had, I'm sure we can work it out." "It's not a disagreement," I replied gently. "David, your mother hired a private investigation firm to conduct illegal surveillance of me. She's obtained protected financial documents, commissioned unauthorized background checks, and paid thousands of dollars to destroy our marriage by exposing what she believes is my criminal past." David's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Disbelief, confusion, then a flash of something that might have been recognition. "That's ridiculous. My mother wouldn't hire private investigators to spy on you." I picked up the folder containing Patricia's signed contract with Rivera and Brooks Investigations and handed it to him. "She hired Rivera and Brooks Investigations. She paid a $50,000 retainer for a comprehensive investigation of your wife's background, specifically requesting evidence that could be used to convince you to end our marriage." David opened the folder and read through the contract, his face growing paler with each paragraph. When he reached Patricia's signature at the bottom, his hands began to shake slightly. "Rivera and Brooks. That's your company." "That's my company," I confirmed. "Your mother unknowingly hired me to investigate myself." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. David sank into the chair I'd prepared, still holding the contract, his eyes moving between the document and the evidence wall Marcus and I had constructed. 25 years of Patricia Chen's criminal activities were laid out in chronological order, with photographs, court documents, newspaper clippings, and surveillance footage, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic fraud and harassment. "I don't understand," David said finally. "Why would she do this? She's never said anything to me about having concerns about you." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, choosing my words carefully. "David, there are things about your mother's past that you don't know. Things she's worked very hard to keep hidden from everyone, including you and your father." David's eyes moved to the timeline on the wall, focusing on a photograph of Patricia being arrested in 1994. "That's her. But that can't be right. She would have told us if she'd ever been arrested." "She's been arrested multiple times," I said gently. "Charged with insurance fraud, bribery, harassment, tax evasion. She's been married 4 times, not once. She's been sued 17 times in the last 15 years, all settled out of court with confidentiality agreements." David stood up abruptly, moving closer to examine the evidence wall. He studied the photographs, read the newspaper headlines, traced the timeline of Patricia's marriages and criminal charges with growing disbelief. When he reached the documents showing Patricia's gradual acquisition of majority control over Chen family holdings, his face went completely white. "She owns 67% of our restaurants," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She legally maneuvered your father into signing over control of the business he built," I confirmed. "It happened gradually over 8 years, presented as anniversary gifts and tax planning strategies." David turned to face me, and I could see the exact moment when the full implications hit him. "She doesn't want you investigated because she's worried about your past. She wants you gone because she's afraid you'll investigate hers." "That's exactly right. David, I'm a forensic accountant with expertise in financial crimes and connections to federal law enforcement agencies. If we ever had marital problems or family conflicts, I'd have both the skills and the motivation to examine your family's business practices and financial history." David slumped back into his chair, running his hands through his hair with the exhausted gesture of someone processing information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about their life. "All those times she hired private investigators to research my girlfriends. She said it was because she wanted to protect me from women who might be interested in the family money." "How many girlfriends?" "Every serious relationship I've had since college," David replied, his voice hollow. "She always found something. Financial problems, family scandals, previous relationships that hadn't ended well. She'd present me with these detailed reports showing why each woman was unsuitable for the family. I felt a chill of understanding. She wasn't protecting you from fortune hunters. She was eliminating anyone who might threaten her control over the family business or discover her criminal activities. The restaurant chain that was supposed to be my inheritance is actually hers," David continued, his voice gaining an edge of anger. "My successful business meetings this week, my plans for financial independence, none of that matters if she controls the family assets." I reached across the table and took his hand. "Actually, it matters more than ever. David, your independent restaurant funding means you're no longer dependent on the Chen family business. You can make decisions based on your own values instead of your mother's expectations." David looked up at me, and I could see him processing the implications. "That's why she's so desperate to get rid of you now. Once I'm financially independent, I might start asking questions she can't afford to answer. And I might help you ask those questions," I added. David stood up again, this time moving to the window that overlooked our quiet residential street. The evening light was fading, and our neighbors were returning home from work, walking dogs, tending gardens. It was the kind of peaceful domesticity that David and I had built our relationship around, and I could see him trying to reconcile that normalcy with the criminal conspiracy that had been targeting our marriage. "Natalie," he said without turning around, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, of course. Is there anything in your past that my mother might discover that could actually damage our marriage? Any secrets or problems I should know about?" I'd been preparing for this question since the moment Marcus handed me Patricia's investigation file. "Yes," I said simply. "There is something significant in my past that your mother is trying to expose." David turned to face me, his expression carefully controlled. "Tell me." I pulled out the folder containing my own story, the truth I'd been afraid to share completely even with Marcus, until Patricia's investigation forced me to confront it. My name wasn't always Natalie Brooks. 6 years ago, I was Teresa Caldwell, married to a man named Trevor Caldwell who owned a financial consulting firm in San Francisco. David sat back down, giving me his complete attention. I thought I was helping my husband build a legitimate business by using my forensic accounting credentials to verify transactions and authorize financial transfers. I continued. What I actually was doing was providing credibility for an elaborate money laundering operation that funneled millions of dollars from illegal gambling, drug trafficking, and other criminal enterprises. David's face remained neutral, but I could see him processing this information carefully. "You didn't know?" I was naive enough to believe that my husband was honest with me about his business practices, I replied. When the FBI raided our offices, I discovered that I'd been signing documents I didn't fully understand, authorizing transactions that violated federal banking laws. I touched the faded scar on my temple, a habit I'd developed when discussing this part of my past. The federal prosecutor offered me immunity in exchange for testifying against Trevor and his associates. Trevor didn't appreciate my cooperation with law enforcement. David noticed my gesture and moved closer to examine the scar. He did that to you? He threw a crystal paperweight at my head during an argument about my planned testimony. I confirmed. Told me that if I testified against him, he'd make sure I never worked in accounting again, never found another husband, never had a normal life. But you testified anyway. After 3 weeks in the hospital, yes. My testimony helped the FBI convict Trevor and 12 of his associates. Trevor disappeared before the trial with about $4 million in liquid assets. But his money laundering network was completely dismantled. David was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information. Finally, he spoke. So when my mother hired private investigators to research your background, they found evidence of your connection to a federal money laundering case. They found evidence that I was married to a criminal, that I filed for bankruptcy after his crimes destroyed my finances, and that I relocated to Portland and started over under my maiden name. I corrected. What they didn't find, because they were looking for evidence of criminal activity rather than law enforcement cooperation, is that I was a key witness who helped federal prosecutors dismantle a major financial crime operation. Patricia thinks she's hired investigators to expose a criminal, David said slowly. What she's actually done is hired investigators to research someone who helped put criminals in prison. That's right. And in the process of trying to expose my supposed crimes, your mother has committed multiple federal crimes herself. David looked back at the evidence wall, focusing on the surveillance photographs and illegally obtained financial documents that Patricia had provided to Rivera and Brooks Investigations. What kind of crimes? Quote, unauthorized access to protected financial databases, illegal acquisition of consumer credit information, violation of federal privacy laws governing healthcare and insurance records. I pulled out the folder containing our documentation of Patricia's criminal network. She's also hired private investigators who operate outside legal boundaries and maintain business relationships with companies that provide illegally obtained information. And you have proof of all this? We have comprehensive documentation, I confirmed. Video surveillance of her meetings with criminal contacts, financial records of payments for illegal services, copies of protected documents that could only have been obtained through criminal activity. David stood up and walked back to the evidence wall, this time studying it with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a complex business structure. After several minutes, he turned back to me with an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of anger, determination, and protective resolve. What do we do now? He asked. Tomorrow afternoon, your mother is expecting a progress report on her investigation of me. I replied. Marcus and I are going to give her exactly what she paid for. Which is a comprehensive report documenting everything we've discovered about Natalie Brooks, forensic accountant and co-owner of Rivera and Brooks Investigations. I paused, meeting his eyes directly, along with everything we've discovered about Patricia Chen, career criminal and fraud expert. David's smile was sharp and determined. She wanted the truth about her daughter-in-law's past. She's going to get the truth about her own past as well. David, you need to understand that once we confront your mother with this evidence, there's no going back. We're talking about federal charges, criminal prosecution, potential asset forfeiture. The Chen family business empire could be destroyed, and your relationship with your mother will never recover. David looked around our kitchen, taking in the peaceful home we'd built together, the life we'd created based on honesty and mutual respect. Natalie, my mother has been targeting my wife with criminal harassment and illegal surveillance. She's obtained protected information about you through federal privacy violations. She's spent decades building a fortune through fraud and manipulation. He moved closer, taking my hands in his. I'd rather lose the family business and my relationship with my mother than lose my marriage to someone who's actually honest and decent. That night, we sat up until nearly 3 a.m, going through every document Marcus and I had compiled, every piece of evidence we'd gathered about Patricia's criminal activities. David asked detailed questions about the timeline, the legal implications, the strength of the evidence we'd collected. What impressed me most was his analytical approach to information that must have been emotionally devastating. David had inherited his father's practical intelligence and his mother's talent for understanding complex situations, but he was using those abilities to seek truth rather than manipulate outcomes. "There's something I need to tell you," David said as we were finally preparing for bed. "My mother didn't just hire private investigators to research you. She also pressured me to ask you specific questions about your past, your family, your previous relationships." I felt a chill of recognition. "What kind of questions?" "She wanted me to find out why you never talked about your parents, why you didn't have any photographs from your childhood, why you'd never introduced me to anyone from your life before Portland." David looked embarrassed. "She said if you were hiding something significant, the best way to discover it would be to make you think I was naturally curious rather than suspicious. So some of our conversations about my past weren't actually your questions." "I'm sorry," David said quietly. "I thought she was just being an overprotective mother. I didn't realize she was conducting an investigation." I thought about the evening conversations we'd had over the past few months, times when David had asked seemingly casual questions about my childhood, my family, my previous career. I'd attributed his curiosity to normal relationship development, not realizing that Patricia was using him as an unwitting investigative tool. "David, did you tell her what I said during those conversations?" "She asked me to let her know if you said anything that seemed inconsistent with your previous explanations," David admitted. "I told her you were private about your past because it was painful, not because you were hiding criminal activity. But she used that information to guide her illegal investigation." I realized the gaps in my history that she told Marcus about, the specific concerns she raised, those came from intelligence you unknowingly provided. David's face reflected the full weight of his unwitting participation in his mother's harassment campaign. "I helped her build a case against you. You answered her questions honestly because you thought she was trying to understand your wife better," I corrected. "You had no way of knowing she was using that information to commission illegal surveillance and background investigations." "But I should have known," David said, sitting heavily on our bed. Looking back, there were signs that her interest in your background wasn't normal maternal concern. The detailed questions, the repeated conversations about the same topics, the way she'd press for specific information about your finances and your previous relationships. I sat down next to him, understanding that David was processing not just the revelation of his mother's criminal activities, but his own unwitting role in her harassment campaign against me. "David, your mother is a professional manipulator who's been using people for decades to accomplish her goals. The fact that she was able to manipulate you doesn't make you responsible for her crimes. But it makes me responsible for not protecting you from her," David replied. "I knew she could be controlling and suspicious. I should have realized that her questions about you were part of something larger." I thought about the past 3 years of our marriage, the subtle tension I'd felt during family gatherings, the sense that Patricia was always evaluating me and finding me lacking. I'd attributed her coldness to normal mother-in-law dynamics, not realizing that she was conducting a systematic assessment of my potential threat to her criminal enterprises. "Tomorrow, when we confront your mother with our findings, she's going to try to manipulate the situation," I said. "She'll probably claim she was trying to protect you, or that she had reasonable concerns about my background that justified her investigation. And she'll probably try to convince me that you've manipulated me into turning against my family," David added. "Are you prepared for that conversation?" David looked at me with an expression of complete certainty. "Natalie, my mother hired criminals to obtain illegal information about my wife. She's committed federal crimes in an attempt to destroy our marriage. She's built a fortune through decades of fraud and manipulation." He paused. "I'm not just prepared to confront her about this. I'm looking forward to it." The next morning, David called in sick to work and spent the day helping Marcus and me prepare for our afternoon meeting with Patricia. We organized our evidence chronologically, created summary documents that highlighted the most significant findings, and developed a presentation strategy that would maximize the impact of our revelations. David's business training proved invaluable in structuring our approach. He suggested we begin with Patricia's current crimes before revealing her historical criminal activities, allowing her to understand the immediate legal consequences before confronting her with the full scope of our discoveries. "She's going to deny everything at first," David predicted. "Then she'll try to minimize the significance of what she's done. Finally, she'll attempt to shift blame to other people, her investigative contacts, her legal advisors, anyone except herself. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's exactly the pattern we see with sophisticated white-collar criminals. They have extensive experience deflecting accountability. But we have something Patricia doesn't expect, I added. Complete documentation of her crimes, legal authority to investigate her activities, and the element of surprise. David smiled with anticipation. She thinks she's meeting with investigators who will confirm her suspicions about her daughter-in-law. Instead, she's walking into a confrontation with investigators who have exposed her entire criminal operation. That afternoon, as we prepared to leave for our meeting with Patricia, David turned to me with an expression of both determination and regret. Natalie, I want you to know that regardless of what happens today, regardless of the consequences for my family or my relationship with my mother, I'm grateful you investigated this situation thoroughly. Even if it destroys your family's business empire? Especially if it destroys my family's business empire, David replied firmly. I'd rather build something honest from nothing than inherit something valuable that was built on criminal activity. As we drove toward our meeting with Patricia Chen, I reflected on the past 2 weeks of investigation and revelation. When Patricia had first walked into Rivera Brooks Investigations with her $50,000 retainer, she'd thought she was hiring professionals to expose her daughter-in-law's criminal past. Instead, she'd financed the most comprehensive investigation of her own criminal activities that had ever been conducted, providing the evidence and resources that would finally bring her decades-long crime spree to an end. The woman who'd spent 25 years getting away with fraud, harassment, and criminal conspiracy was about to discover that her greatest mistake had been underestimating the 2 people she'd hired to destroy. The conference room at Rivera Brooks Investigations had never felt smaller than it did that Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. When Patricia Chen walked through our door carrying the same cream-colored Chanel handbag she'd brought to every previous meeting, and wearing an expression of confident expectation. She had no idea that her son was sitting in Marcus's office, watching through the one-way mirror we'd installed for client observation during sensitive cases. Patricia settled into the same chair she'd occupied during our initial meeting, her posture perfect, and her smile professionally warm. Mr. Rivera, Ms. Brooks, I hope you have good news for me. I'm eager to hear what you've discovered about this woman my son married. Marcus and I exchanged a meaningful glance before I opened the thick folder containing our investigation results. Mrs. Chen, we've conducted the most comprehensive background investigation in our firm's history. You asked for a thorough examination of Natalie Brooks, and that's exactly what you're going to receive. Excellent, Patricia replied, leaning forward slightly with anticipation. I knew you were the right firm for this work. I slid the first document across the table. A detailed biography of Natalie Brooks, complete with educational background, professional history, and personal relationships. Natalie Brooks graduated summa cum laude from the University of California at Berkeley with a degree in accounting and finance. She earned her CPA certification while working for Deloitte & Touche in San Francisco, where she specialized in forensic accounting and fraud detection. Patricia's expression remained attentive but neutral as she skimmed through the biography. This is all very impressive, but what about the gaps in her employment history, the financial problems, the suspicious background elements I identified in my preliminary research? Marcus pulled out a second folder, this one significantly thicker than the first. We investigated those concerns thoroughly, Mrs. Chen. The employment gaps you identified occurred because Ms. Brooks was working under her married name, Teresa Caldwell, during her previous marriage to Trevor Caldwell. Previous marriage? Patricia's voice sharpened with interest. She was married before David? Yes, I confirmed, watching Patricia's face carefully. Teresa Caldwell was married to Trevor Caldwell, who owned a financial consulting firm called Cascade Financial. The marriage ended when Trevor was arrested by federal agents for operating a money laundering scheme that processed millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. Patricia's eyes lit up with what looked like vindication. So she was involved in criminal activity. Actually, no, Marcus replied smoothly. Teresa Caldwell was the key witness who helped the FBI build their case against the money laundering operation. Her forensic accounting expertise and willingness to testify against her husband resulted in the conviction of Trevor Caldwell and 12 of his criminal associates. I watched the satisfaction drain from Patricia's face as the implications became clear. The financial problems you discovered, the bankruptcy, the damaged credit, the period of low income, those were the consequences of being married to a criminal, not the results of criminal activity herself. But surely there must be some evidence of wrongdoing, Patricia protested. The gaps in her history, the reluctance to discuss her family background, the inconsistencies in her story. Marcus opened a third folder and spread its contents across the table. Bank statements, tax returns, employment records, and federal court documents created a comprehensive picture of someone who had rebuilt their life after being victimized by criminal activity. Mrs. Chen, we found no evidence of any criminal wrongdoing by Natalie Brooks. In fact, we found extensive evidence of her cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies in prosecuting financial crimes. Patricia stared at the documents with growing agitation. This can't be right. There has to be something. The investigators I hired before you found clear evidence of suspicious financial activity and questionable background elements. About those previous investigators, I said, pulling out a fourth folder that contained surveillance photographs and financial transaction records. We need to discuss the methods they used to obtain the information they provided to you. Patricia's expression shifted from agitation to wariness. What do you mean? Marcus placed a photograph on the table showing Patricia meeting with Tony Marchetti in the parking lot of a Beaverton strip mall. This is you exchanging money for illegally obtained financial documents. Tony Marchetti specializes in providing clients with protected information that can't be legally obtained through normal channels. I don't know what you're talking about, Patricia said, though her voice had lost its confident tone. I added a second photograph showing Patricia entering Northwest Credit Services. This is you visiting a company that lost its license to access protected financial databases in 2018. They continue to operate by providing illegal access to consumer credit information. Patricia's face had gone pale, but she maintained her defensive posture. I hired legitimate investigative firms to research my concerns about my daughter-in-law. If their methods were questionable, that's their responsibility, not mine. Mrs. Chen, Marcus said gently, federal privacy laws make it illegal to knowingly receive protected financial information that was obtained without proper authorization. The penalties include substantial fines and potential imprisonment. Furthermore, I added, opening our comprehensive investigation file, our research revealed that this isn't the first time you've hired private investigators to obtain illegal information about people you perceived as threats. Patricia's composure began to crack as we laid out 25 years of her criminal activities, court records documenting her multiple arrests, newspaper articles describing insurance fraud charges, civil lawsuit filings showing a pattern of harassment and stalking behaviors, financial documents revealing how she'd gradually acquired control of the Chen family business empire through legal manipulation. Where did you get all this? Patricia demanded, her voice rising with panic. Public records, Marcus replied calmly. Court filings, business incorporation documents, arrest records, civil lawsuit databases. All completely legal and readily available to anyone who knows how to conduct thorough research. I leaned forward, studying Patricia's increasingly desperate expression. Mrs. Chen, you hired Rivera and Brooks Investigations because you believed we were the best private detective firm in Portland. You were right. We are the best at uncovering the truth, documenting evidence, and exposing criminal activity. The problem, Marcus continued, is that you hired us to investigate someone who had no criminal history while you yourself have an extensive history of criminal behavior that's all documented in public records. Patricia stood up abruptly, knocking over her coffee cup and sending liquid spreading across our carefully organized documents. This is harassment. You're supposed to be working for me, not against me. We are working for you, I replied, standing as well. You hired us to conduct a comprehensive investigation and provide you with documented evidence of criminal activity. That's exactly what we've done. You hired us to investigate Natalie Brooks, Marcus added, and our investigation revealed that Natalie Brooks is a forensic accountant with an impeccable professional reputation who helped federal agents prosecute financial criminals. Patricia's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow as the full scope of our discoveries became apparent. You can't use this information. I'm your client. You have confidentiality obligations. Client privilege doesn't protect criminal activity, I informed her. When a client hires investigators to commit crimes or cover up crimes they've already committed, we're legally required to report that information to appropriate authorities. What authorities? Patricia whispered. Marcus pulled out a business card and placed it on the table next to the spreading coffee stain. Detective Morrison, Portland Police Department Financial Crimes Unit. He's been investigating your activities for 25 years, and he's very interested in reviewing our comprehensive case file. You contacted the police? Patricia's voice was barely audible. We contacted federal authorities, I corrected. Your criminal activities cross state lines and involve federal privacy violations, which makes this a federal case. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit will be taking over the investigation from local law enforcement. Patricia sank back into her chair, staring at the evidence of her crimes spread across the table. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked older than her 62 years, the careful facade of respectability cracking to reveal the desperation underneath. Mrs. Chin, Marcus said, his tone becoming almost gentle, you have two options. You can cooperate with federal investigators, provide complete information about your criminal network, and hope for a plea agreement that minimizes your prison sentence. Or you can continue denying your activities and face the full consequences of a federal racketeering prosecution. Racketeering? Patricia's voice cracked on the word. RICO charges, I confirmed. Decades of organized criminal activity involving multiple conspirators and ongoing fraud schemes. The penalties are severe, and the legal protections are limited. Patricia was quiet for several long minutes, apparently processing the magnitude of her situation. Finally, she looked up at us with what might have been genuine curiosity. How long have you known? Known what, Mrs. Chen? Known that I was investigating myself when I hired you. I smiled, though there was no humor in it. We realized it the moment you handed us your retainer check. Natalie Brooks is my maiden name. I'm Natalie Chen, your daughter-in-law. Patricia's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, recognition, and finally, a kind of grudging respect. You're Teresa Caldwell, the forensic accountant who testified against the money laundering operation. I'm Natalie Brooks Chen, I corrected. The woman who helped federal prosecutors convict financial criminals, who rebuilt her life after being victimized by fraud, and who now owns the detective agency you hired to investigate yourself. And I'm Marcus Rivera, Marcus added, the private investigator you trusted with your criminal conspiracy because you didn't bother to research the company you were hiring. Patricia laughed, but it was the hollow sound of someone who'd just realized the full scope of their mistake. You let me pay you $50,000 to investigate my own daughter-in-law, knowing she was your business partner. We provided exactly the service you requested, I replied. A comprehensive investigation of Natalie Brooks, complete with documented evidence and professional analysis. You just didn't expect the results to contradict your assumptions. The conference room door opened and David walked in, followed by Detective Morrison and two federal agents wearing dark suits and serious expressions. Patricia's face went completely white as she realized that her son had been watching the entire confrontation. Hello, Mother, David said, his voice carefully controlled. I think we need to have a conversation about your business practices. Patricia looked between David and me, apparently realizing for the first time that her attempt to destroy our marriage had actually strengthened our relationship by forcing us to confront her criminal activities together. David, I can explain everything. I was trying to protect you from making a mistake. By committing federal crimes? David asked. By hiring criminals to obtain illegal information about my wife? By building a fortune through decades of fraud and manipulation? Everything I did was for this family, Patricia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Everything you did was for yourself, David replied. You manipulated Dad into signing over control of his business. You eliminated anyone who might threaten your control over family decisions. You targeted my wife because you were afraid she might investigate your criminal activities. Detective Morrison stepped forward, placing a pair of handcuffs on the table next to Patricia's purse. Mrs. Chen, I'm placing you under arrest for violation of federal privacy laws, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and racketeering under the RICO Act. You have the right to remain silent. As Morrison read Patricia her rights, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was finally being served after decades of Patricia's criminal behavior, but watching David's mother being arrested was still emotionally difficult. Patricia stood with dignity as the handcuffs were applied, maintaining her composure, even as her carefully constructed world collapsed around her. As the federal agents escorted her toward the door, she turned back to look at David one final time. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I know you are, Mom," David replied. "But sorry doesn't undo 25 years of criminal activity." After Patricia was taken away, the three of us sat in the suddenly quiet conference room, surrounded by evidence of a criminal enterprise that had finally been exposed. Detective Morrison gathered up the documents that would become part of the federal case file, while David and I processed what had just occurred. "What happens now?" David asked. "Federal prosecution," Morrison replied. "With this much evidence and this comprehensive a pattern of criminal behavior, Patricia will likely face significant prison time. The plea negotiations will determine whether she serves 5 years or 15. What about the family business? That depends on how much of the Chen restaurant empire was built with proceeds from criminal activity," Morrison explained. "If federal investigators determine that the businesses were purchased or expanded using funds obtained through fraud, they could be subject to asset forfeiture." David nodded, though I could see him struggling with the implications. "So I might lose everything my father built." "You might lose everything your mother stole," I corrected gently. "David, your sustainable restaurant concept is funded through legitimate investors who believe in your vision and your abilities. You don't need the Chen family empire to build something successful and honest. Besides," Morrison added, "your father might retain ownership of business assets that can be proven to have been purchased with legitimate funds. The forfeiture process targets criminal proceeds, not innocent family members." Over the following weeks, the full scope of Patricia's criminal network became apparent as federal investigators followed the leads we'd provided. Tony Marchetti was arrested for operating an illegal information brokerage service. Northwest Credit Services was shut down, and its owners were charged with federal privacy violations. 3 other private investigation firms lost their licenses for providing illegally obtained information to wealthy clients. The investigation revealed that Patricia had been the central figure in a sophisticated criminal network that specialized in providing illegal information and harassment services to Portland's wealthy elite. Her decades of criminal activity had generated over $3 million in proceeds, most of which she'd used to acquire control of legitimate businesses and real estate investments. David's father, Robert, filed for divorce immediately after Patricia's arrest, claiming that he'd been unaware of his wife's criminal activities and that she'd acquired control of his business through fraudulent misrepresentation. The divorce proceedings revealed that Robert had been manipulated and deceived by Patricia for their entire 12-year marriage. 6 months after Patricia's arrest, David and I attended the opening night of his first sustainable restaurant, located in a beautifully renovated warehouse space in Portland's Pearl District. The investors who'd funded his concept had remained committed to the project despite the family scandal, impressed by David's integrity in exposing his mother's crimes rather than protecting them. The restaurant was everything David had envisioned: locally sourced ingredients, zero-waste preparation methods, and a dining experience that celebrated both environmental responsibility and culinary excellence. Food critics praised the innovative menu, environmental activists celebrated the sustainable practices, and customers loved the quality and creativity of every dish. As we stood together watching the packed dining room on opening night, David turned to me with an expression of deep gratitude and love. "Natalie, I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything that happened, even the parts that were painful. Even losing your relationship with your mother?" "Especially losing my relationship with my mother," David replied. "I spent 34 years thinking I was part of a respectable family business built on hard work and traditional values. Now I know I was actually part of a criminal enterprise built on fraud and manipulation." He gestured toward the bustling restaurant around us. "This is what I want to build. Something honest, something that benefits the community, something I can be proud of without reservations." A year later, Patricia Chen was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to racketeering, wire fraud, and multiple violations of federal privacy laws. She'd cooperated with federal investigators, providing information that led to additional arrests and the dismantling of several other illegal information networks operating in the Pacific Northwest. The Chen restaurant empire was partially dissolved, with 3 locations being seized as assets purchased with criminal proceeds. Robert Chen retained ownership of the original restaurant and 2 others that were purchased before Patricia's involvement in the business. He continued operating them under new management, having learned expensive lessons about trusting business partners who might have hidden criminal agendas. David's sustainable restaurant concept expanded to include 5 locations throughout Oregon and Washington, making him one of the most successful young restaurateurs in the region. His business model became a template for other environmentally conscious dining establishments, and he was frequently invited to speak at conferences about sustainable business practices. Rivera Brooks Investigations gained national recognition for our role in exposing Patricia's criminal network, leading to consulting contracts with federal agencies and private clients throughout the country. Our expertise in uncovering sophisticated white-collar crime made us the go-to firm for cases involving financial fraud, privacy violations, and organized criminal activity. Most importantly, David and I discovered that surviving a criminal conspiracy together had strengthened our marriage in ways we hadn't expected. We'd learned to trust each other completely, communicate honestly about difficult situations, and work together as partners in facing whatever challenges life might present. On our 4th wedding anniversary, we hosted a small celebration at David's newest restaurant location, surrounded by friends and family members who'd supported us through the difficult period of Patricia's investigation and prosecution. David's father was there, having rebuilt his relationship with his son based on honesty and mutual respect, rather than business obligations and family expectations. Aunt Caroline gave a toast celebrating our marriage and praising our courage in choosing truth over comfortable deception. Marcus and Detective Morrison shared stories about the investigation that had brought down one of Portland's most sophisticated criminal networks. Even some of David's siblings attended, having gradually come to understand that exposing Patricia's crimes had been necessary to protect the entire family from her ongoing criminal activities. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. 3 years ago, I'd been terrified that my past would eventually surface and destroy the peaceful life I'd built with David. I'd never imagined that my mother-in-law would pay me $50,000 to investigate myself, or that her criminal conspiracy would ultimately strengthen my marriage rather than destroy it. David joined me on the restaurant's outdoor patio, where we could see the lights of downtown Portland twinkling in the distance. "Do you ever regret how everything happened?" he asked. I thought about the question seriously. The past year had been emotionally difficult, legally complex, and personally challenging in ways I'd never expected. But it had also been liberating, honest, and ultimately redemptive. "I regret that your mother spent decades hurting people through criminal activity," I replied. "I regret that you had to discover such painful truths about someone you loved. But I don't regret that we exposed her crimes, and I definitely don't regret that we faced this challenge together." David smiled and pulled me closer. "You know what I realized during this whole experience?" "What's that?" "The truth really does set you free, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful." As we stood together looking out over the city where we'd built our honest, peaceful life, I thought about Patricia Chen sitting in a federal prison, finally facing consequences for decades of criminal behavior. Part of me felt sorry for her, understanding that her crimes had ultimately been motivated by fear and insecurity rather than pure malice. But mostly, I felt grateful that her greatest mistake, hiring the best private investigators in Portland to destroy someone who turned out to be one of those investigators, had finally brought her criminal career to an end. Sometimes justice comes in the form of irony, and sometimes the truth finds a way to surface, even when powerful people spend decades trying to bury it. Patricia Chen had spent 25 years getting away with criminal activity because she was careful, connected, and ruthless enough to eliminate threats before they could expose her. She'd finally met her match in the form of a daughter-in-law who was more skilled at uncovering financial crimes than Patricia was at concealing them, partnered with a private investigator who was more experienced at building criminal cases than Patricia was at evading prosecution. The woman who'd thought she was hiring professionals to destroy her son's marriage had actually financed the investigation that destroyed her criminal empire. And in the process, she'd given David and me the greatest gift possible: complete honesty about our past, present, and future together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.